is a native. Jane is a native of Denison, Ohio, and Denison, Iowa. Pardon me. Don't tell the Iowans I said that. For which she draws a great deal of her strength, I think, and you'll see that if you have a chance to read her remarkable book. But she's also been a longtime resident and advocate in Pasadena. She has worked in depth with the very outstanding humanitarian work provided by the All Saints Episcopal Church, working with amazing people there that have really created phenomenal international events. She's a passionate and tenacious humanitarian, and she has chronicled some of the most challenging, if not horrific, human crises of our times, which sadly I'm saying we continue to have. She's traveled all over the world, lending her intelligence, eloquence, and heart to those that she has met, and brought their stories to important global humanitarian institutions such as the United Nations, especially the United Nations section on refugees. Now she's sharing those stories with those of us who've had the pleasure of reading her new book, World Citizen, which I highly recommend. It's available on Amazon. I just told Jane it's been getting 5 stars. It's a fascinating and amazingly written book that is something I think that we all share in terms of our desire to make the world a better place. Jane has been the chair of the international section of the board of the Human Rights Watch from 2004 to 2010. She was the co-chair of Women's Refugee Commission and one of the founding chairs of Landmine Survivors Network, which is now Survivor Corps. And I will remind those that don't know that two of those organizations shared the Nobel Peace Prize, or the Nobel Prize for landmine eradication, I believe, several years ago. Her tireless advocacy for the underserved around the world has garnered her many awards for her work, including the Alison DeForge Award for Human Rights Watch, the Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Feminist Majority in 2005, and in 2010 she was presented with the Women Making History Award by Senator Barbara Boxer. She also, I just found out, won the Corita Kent Award for her advocacy for other people around the world. And I also put in that she is a terrific art enthusiast and helped found the Armory in Pasadena. Perhaps most importantly, Jane has received accolades, thanks, and gratitude from the many, many people she has met under some of the most horrendous circumstances. And tonight, she's agreed to share some of these stories and reflect on her remarkable career as an international humanitarian. So please welcome Jane Olson.
Thank you very much, Kim. I really appreciate it, and wonderful to see all of you. I learned from Kim I have 5 stars on Amazon. I don't bother to look up those things. But as she mentioned, I really am a housewife in Pasadena, California. And I did a lot of volunteers work throughout this community. You know, was an old bumper sticker that said, "Think global, act local." And I actually did just the opposite. I worked local, and I learned a lot of the skills that I took into the field and into these my roles of leadership in these international organizations through all the work that I did here in the Los Angeles area. I guess you mentioned that I grew up in Iowa, which is extremely important. And the thread that weaves all of my stories together is the legacy of my childhood, the lessons I learned, role models I had growing up there. And I think one thing that it taught me is that every single person in a community counts. I grew up in a very small town. Mostly it was all related to farm. And I didn't develop any kind of prejudice. It was primarily an all-white community. There really wasn't any prejudice. I didn't learn to discriminate, one person inferior to another based on anything, but their willingness to work and contribute to a community. So many of the autobiographies that we're learning today start with people who've had really broken childhoods. The book Educated, the book I Know Where the Crawdads Sing. Both of those women characters had just horrible, horrible childhoods. And I didn't. I had a very solid, loving grounding in small town Iowa. So that really matters. I started the international work really as a result of the peace and justice community that All Saints Church in Pasadena provided me. I was asked to start a program based on the nuclear arms race. We held a huge conference called Reversing the Arms Race, and then developed a center, the Interfaith Center to Reverse the Arms Race, which combined, Christians, even Catholic Church as well, Jews, and the Islamic Center, all working together to educate the world that nuclear weapons must never ever be used. And of course, now we're seeing that threat rising again at this time. I should tell you that I put on this scarf, which is Ukrainian colors, because this is a very hard week and I have many, many friends in Ukraine. My first journey was to Nicaragua and El Salvador. All Saints sent a delegation of 4 people. I was by far the youngest, 25 years the youngest, to investigate whether what our government was saying about Nicaragua and the threat that Nicaragua, that tiny little country, posed to our democracy. It was really an education for me to put everything in perspective and understand that not all that we hear from our government is true. As a result of doing that, I just realized that this is what I wanted to do, but I still had children at home, and I needed another 5 to 7 years, and I wanted to raise my children. So I didn't go abroad again until 1989. And at that time, I was part of a small delegation from All Saints Church, but 100 Americans who were invited to go to the former Soviet Union, specifically to Ukraine. We went to Ukraine and were able to go on a cruise with 100 Soviet citizens, a mix of Russian and Ukrainians, down the Dnieper River to all those cities that you're seeing between Kiev and Odessa that are now being bombed. That region had been completely shut off during the whole of the Cold War, because that's where they manufactured a lot of military weapons, including nuclear weapons. So people who lived there in cities like Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, Kherson, that you're seeing on the news now as being targeted, people who lived there couldn't leave, and not even other Soviet citizens could go there. So we were the first delegation, and I literally was representing the United States of America to people who had never seen an American, but had heard a lot of negative propaganda about us. That also was an incredible learning experience, because I was a little bit fearful. We were the enemy to them. And we were greeted so warmly and with so much curiosity, and, dancing and flowers and beautiful breads. I mean, everything. The minute we approached every city, we were just welcomed with a whole city party. I went back again the following year. I was invited to go back, and that time I took my daughter, and that was in August of 1990. And we just happened to start our trip and be in Kiev in the Independence Square the very day they tore down the hammer and sickle flag and raised the yellow and blue flag for the very first time. It was extraordinary. And by utter coincidence, I was wearing a cotton knit dress that was yellow and blue, the same color as the flag. There were tens of thousands of people in that square. But Kristen and I, my daughter, who had just was in graduate school, she was studying international studies and had been in Europe for the past year. She and I were pushed to the front of the crowd and pushed up onto the platform where the speakers were, and given flags, and we're there waving flags and singing and dancing. And it was quite extraordinary. We were told later that there were 1,000 Russian troops behind the Parliament building, ready to come out and with any provocation, kill everybody. Luckily, I didn't know that at the time. But I just have such heart for Ukraine, and I would, and I'm hearing every single day from friends that I met in 1989 that are still friends, and now that with the internet we can communicate. They're expressing so much gratitude for U.S. support and love for America. It's amazing how much they envy and desire a free and democratic country and hold us up as the model. So the next year, in 1991, the former Soviet Union started breaking apart. I happened to be in Moscow. There's a little bit of Forrest Gump to all of this. I happened to be in Moscow at the time that a coup attempt against Gorbachev was held. Do you all remember that? Military generals attacked Gorbachev at his vacation resort in Crimea, held him hostage, and tried to take over the government. I was going with Human Rights Watch as a representative to something called the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. First time it had ever been held behind the Iron Curtain, and it was a real privilege to be there. But I mean, at the time, it was extremely tense. All the tanks were coming from all over the surrounding area into Moscow, right into the Kremlin, right in front of beautiful St. Basil's Cathedral. There were loads of tanks. I have a whole chapter on that I really encourage you to read. It's called Comfort Food, and it talks about how the women of Moscow saved Moscow by feeding the young soldiers who were in the tanks, who had no idea where they were or why they were there. And the women went out with macaroni and soup and said, "Come on out, we're your mothers, we're your sisters, and we know you're hungry. Let us feed you." It was an extraordinary experience. But shortly after that, really the next year, the whole of the Soviet Union started falling apart. And you remember that the wars broke out between a lot of the republics. Many of the republics had been put together, like the former Yugoslavia was a country that was made at the end of World War I, putting together enemies who had been enemies for centuries. But the experience of Azerbaijan and Armenia and the Caucasus was very similar. Stalin, in order to keep down repression, had sort of moved people around. He didn't want any big groups of people to pose a threat. So he tried to change the borders and separate people. And as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, there were all kinds of wars. So believe me, I got my notebooks, my cameras, loaded up with film. I was trained as an investigative reporter and photographer. I went to the University of Nebraska College of Journalism. And I went with various organizations to many of these war zones. And I took notes and took loads of photographs, and often I would end up writing the reports. I went as a volunteer and board member with staff people like International Rescue Committee, organizations like that, who had staff people who worked there around the clock. They're the real heroes. I don't want to suggest that I'm any kind of a hero, but I would go in for 2 or 3 weeks, chronicle things, and then write the reports and come back, and we'd circulate the reports to all the United Nations agencies and other venues to try to get support for the needs of people. In all of these situations, 80% of the refugees, the people who have to flee the country, flee across borders, are women and children. And it turned out that we would go into refugee camps, and sometimes there'd be 5,000 women and children in these just pathetic barracks of buildings that in the winter, the wind would go whipping through it. They set them up with metal framed bunk beds 3 high, and they hardly had any possessions. The first one I went into, I felt like an intruder, but we went, a delegation from the Women's Refugee Commission went to investigate a report that rape was being used as a weapon of war. And the first barracks that we went into, there were 52 newborn babies. And it was quite clear that these women had been victims of rape, a lot of teenage girls. I just became obsessed with that war. I went about, I don't know, I wrote 11 chapters in my book mostly about the former Yugoslavia and the ethnic cleansing of Bosnia. It was a horrendous war. Bosnia was kind of the heart of Yugoslavia. There were 6 republics, and Bosnia was the largest. It was right in the center, with Serbia here and Croatia here. And the political party bosses of those 2 republics, Serbia and Croatia, decided to carve up Bosnia, kill or eliminate the mostly Muslim population of Bosnia, and take over the land. It was really a land grab and an effort to secure greater power. It was a war against civilians. The Muslims were not religious Muslims. They were Muslims. They were people who were descendants of the Ottoman Empire, basically. They didn't even understand the religion. They didn't practice their religion because under the Soviet Union, nobody could practice religion throughout the whole of the Soviet Union. But they were being killed because of their religion. So they began to become a little bit radicalized. And as the war progressed, thousands and thousands of people fled across the borders. But the greater phenomenon was called internally displaced people. It was people whose homes had been destroyed, whose villages had been destroyed, but who had no place to go, couldn't get across the border. So I want to tell you a story about one of my trips, which was 3 years into that war, which would have been 1995. There was a town in the central Bosnia that I hadn't been to before. It's a town called Fonica. And by this time in the war, a town that had been about 5,000 people, the size of my hometown, now had 50,000 internally displaced people. It was packed with Muslim people from all over the country who were forced into that place, a central place that they were trying to defend. And as always, I'm looking for women that I can talk to get their story. And I happened to meet a woman named Mincy. She had an office in this funny little place that I guess was a resort. It's an area in the mountains that probably had a lot of summer tourists in normal times. And we were told to go visit her because she was a leader and had founded an organization called the Women Survivors of War Crimes, which really intrigued me. So we went to visit her, and she greeted us, of course, with tea, and we sat and talked to her very politely. And I asked her if she would tell me her personal story. Of course, I was working with an interpreter. So Mincy started, she looked down, paused for a long time, and then she said, I was 7 months pregnant when the Serbs came to my village. They surrounded the town and fired shells for days. And we all had to stay in our homes. We couldn't go outside because anybody who went outside was shot. And then eventually they drove tanks into the town with foot soldiers and soldiers coming out of trucks, and they ordered everyone to come out of their homes onto the streets. And then they went around and they shot all the men and the older boys, teenager boys. They just killed them. Threw their bodies back into the houses and set the houses on fire. Some of them were not yet dead, and there were just horrible screams. She said she could never forget the screams and the stench and the horror of it all. She had a 10-year-old son whose name was Semko, and she was 7 months pregnant, as I told you. She said that the Serbs rounded up the women, and especially the younger women, put them in trucks and drove them out of town. They took them to a holding place for a while, and then eventually trucked them all to a schoolhouse where in one school building, they had 500 women and girls. She said mostly young women and teenage girls. They put 33 to a classroom that was like 9. Well, I don't want to give you dimensions, a small classroom. And she said we were so packed in that only a few could lie down at a time. We had to stand all day. And she said the militia would come day and night and pull us out outside and rape us, sometimes many soldiers at a time. And if a man refused or couldn't rape or didn't participate, he was ordered at gunpoint to rape us. And one of the women said that she was a nurse, and that one of the men who raped her was a doctor that she worked with in the hospital. She said, I worked with him in the surgery every day, and I couldn't believe that he knew my family, he knew my husband. I couldn't believe he would do that. It was just that vicious. The teenage girls were also tortured and with cigarette burns and so on. And Mency said eventually, and she said, I willed myself to live for my son. But eventually, some men from a nearby village came in the night and rescued the women and girls and took them to this town, Funice, which had become a refuge for internally displaced people. So she said, in the beginning, I just curled up. I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, but I realized I had to be strong for my son. And she said, then I looked around, and there were hundreds of other women and girls who were coming in. And she said, I realized that the girls were, the teenage girls were like zombies. They had lost connection to their bodies. And I realized that I had to do something to help them. So she rounded up the other women close to her age and said, would you join me in doing something to help these girls? They set up a kind of a salon, a beauty salon for the girls, and gave them facials and hair treatments and massages, and talked to them gently, sang to them, rocked them as if they were children, trying to give these girls the will to live. And she said eventually we felt that we were at a place where we could form this club, this organization. She said, I called it the Society for Women Survivors of War Crimes. And she said, survivors, not victims, because if we call ourselves victims, then we will have lost. And every woman who joined this, she said she now had 800 women. Every woman had to sign a pledge that she would not hate or seek revenge, and would teach her children, the next generation, not to hate the Serbs, because she said that's the only way we can break this cycle of violence that's been going on for hundreds of years. In the town had been a center for textile production. There was a textile factory. The factory had been bombed and burned. The building was still standing, but everything inside was ashes. But one of the women in the Women's Society of Survivors was a fashion model, a fashion designer model from Sarajevo, a very sophisticated woman. And she had the idea of teaching the girls how to sew. And so they had some of the refugee men pull the workable sewing machines out of the rubble and oil them, set them up, and then in a working order. And then she said she could design clothes for the girls and design patterns, and they could learn how to sew, which would give them something to occupy them. The only problem is they had no fabrics, because all the fabrics had burned in the fires. So one of the women had a very brilliant idea, and that was to use the burlap bags that the World Food Program brought in. The World Food Program delivered food in burlap bags, so the potatoes, rice, beans, and so on. And they had a huge supply of those. So they washed them and softened them, and then the fashion designer cut out patterns and showed the girls taught them how to cut and sew the stitches together, or sew the fabrics together. And then they gave us a fashion show that night that was amazing. These, skinny teenage survivors of horrendous abuse were modeling these clothes, and I want to show you. I bought some and brought some home. Here's a little skirt. You can see that stamped on the burlap, this one has some Arabic on it, is a description of the food that's inside, and also the country that it came from. And this is a little jumper. You can see this one came from Brazil. It has BRA at the top, little straps, little shorts. I bought a lot of these. I always carry a lot of cash, and I brought them home, and then I took them all over when I gave talks everywhere. I brought these fashions and showed them, and sometimes would have my daughters or some of their friends model them. It was just an amazing experience. It's a story I've told many times because it sort of sums up everything. The cruelty, the horror, the torture, the horrendous experience of especially women, but also the will to survive and to carry on. And one of the things that helps with survival is reaching out to others. When you reach out and help someone else, you forget your own suffering. And Mincy just showed that spirit. She carried such a light. I went to Azerbaijan and Armenia many times with the Women's Refugee Commission primarily, but also with landmine survivors. I made several trips to Africa, and I know since the Phil Simon Clinic is in Tanzania, I wanted to tell one of my stories from Africa. I went to Malawi with the HIV AIDS program, Gaia, and went all over Malawi, dealing with the issue of AIDS orphans was just overwhelming. There were millions and millions of children who had lost their parents, and children raising children, little girls with babies strapped on their backs. I went to Ghana with World Vision and a team of nurses, male nurses, who took 7 hours, more than that actually, to get up into the far, far reaches of northern Ghana, where there were diseases that are from the Dark Ages. I saw elephantiasis. You saw that picture in my book, Kim. Lots of guinea worm, lots of blindness, trachoma, river blindness, just horrendous diseases that really come from unclean water, from insects, from the filth and degradation they have to live with. And I've never seen such stoic people. Little boys lying on a board while doctors and nurses perform guinea worm surgery on him, and the whole village is surrounding, watching this procedure. Amazing. And of course, I was obsessed with Rwanda. I adopted a survivor of Rwanda. I have one chapter about her. It's called Happy from Rwanda. A young woman who, at the time of the genocide, was only 16 years old, and she was the sole survivor of her family of 8. I met her at the United Nations, where she was there speaking on behalf of all of Rwanda. We brought in a group of women and girls to talk about war crimes against women, and it was really an appeal for the setting up of the International Criminal Court. It was before the International Criminal Court had been established, and we brought in women from all over the world, Human Rights Watch and the Women's Refugee Commission together, to tell their stories and plead with the world to set up a war crimes tribunal. I went to the war crimes tribunal for Rwanda that was in Arusha, Tanzania, and got to witness the trial of the 4 generals who were the chief insiders of the genocide. The story I want to tell you, and I'm going to have to do it a little bit quickly, was from a trip to Rwanda. I'm sorry, not Rwanda, Uganda, which is just north of Rwanda. That whole Great Lakes region, the Congo, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi. I mean, it's all has had such a tragic history of extreme violence. In Uganda, it was a rather unique scenario. There was a warlord named Joseph Kony who gathered a militia of other Ugandans, and they would go from village to village and kidnap children as young as 7 and 8 years old, boys and girls. And they'd have the children kill their parents and burn their own houses so they'd have no place to go back to. They trained these kids to be killers. I went there with Landmine Survivors Network a couple different times because one of the issues they had was they had a lot of amputees. One of the MOs of the Lord's Resistance Army under Joseph Kony was to cut off limbs, arms and legs, also ears, noses. It was just absolutely brutal. But they'd take these children and march them through the jungle. The boys had to carry the guns, and they had to do, a lot of killing in other villages too. They were forced to. The girls had to serve as cooks and also had to carry all the food and bedding and so on, and they had to serve as wives to the soldiers. It was just, a whole generation was lost. So I went into one refugee camp in northern Uganda around Gulu and met with many different very badly wounded people. But I wanted to meet I asked our guide if there were any children who had just come out of the jungle, any children who had just been rescued and were new to the camp. And he said there were 3 or 4 boys living on the outskirts of the camp that they wouldn't come in. I mean, the camp was really mud huts, basically, all right next to each other. They wouldn't come in and live with other people. They were staying out there by themselves, and they weren't communicating even with each other. So the social workers hadn't been able to reach them. And I said, that's who I want to see. So we walked out there, and I saw a boy who looked like he was about 14 years old sitting on a log. And my guide told me that he hadn't spoken a single word, that he was one of the most closed up human beings he'd ever seen in his life, that he was a threat for suicide. He wouldn't come in because he didn't have any social skills whatsoever. He'd never learned to be a child. He didn't know how to play. All he knew how to do was kill people. I saw this 14-year-old boy, and I just decided to sit down on the other end of the log beside him. And he flinched when I sat down, and I just looked straight ahead. I didn't look at him, and I just sat there for some time. And he had his arms like this across the solar plexus, and he was just shut down. I always carry a backpack full of supplies, and I took a photograph that I always carry with me of my own 8 grandchildren. I set the photograph of my blonde, blue-eyed boys, who were ranged from 4 years old to 10 years old at the time. I set it on the log in front of this boy, and I saw him look at it, then look away, and I thought, oh my gosh, he must think these kids must look like they're from another planet. I didn't try to talk to him. I just wanted to be with him. It was very hot, and I reached in my backpack for something I could fan myself with, and found a paperback book. I often carry children's books with me on these trips. And I picked up the book that I had and started fanning myself like this. And he looked at me, looked down, and then he looked back again, looked down. And I reached out to touch him, and I saw that he had this huge scar on his arm where he'd been cut, and he flinched. So I backed off, and I just kind of hummed to him and just sat there. Finally, I decided I was going to have to leave. So I took the book and I set it down by the picture of my grandsons. And the book was Francis, the story of Francis the Bull, which is a story about a young bull whose father was a great champion bull, only Ferdinand didn't want to fight. He liked flowers and he wouldn't fight. And it shows pictures of Ferdinand with the flowers and the other bulls fighting each other, and Ferdinand smelling the flowers and doing gentle things. I left that book beside the photograph and walked away, and I was maybe 15 feet away, and I turned back and I saw him reach down and pick up the book and then look at me with a big smile. Sometimes that's what it takes when someone is so, when someone has lost their humanity in such torturous conditions that all you can do is just be there. But I had this feeling that this child was the reason I was there, that I had gone to Uganda to find this child and to leave this book, and hoping that it would help him come back to himself and that he could eventually come back to his village and perhaps eventually even establish a family of his own. It's little things like that that keep you going.
Wow. Really, really powerful stuff, Jane. And you know, there's in your book, you have so many stories like that where there's this really horrendously awful dehumanization going on, whether it's murdering someone or dismembering someone or raping someone, and the circumstances surrounding it are just horrific. But you're very good at identifying some humanity there, and some both in victims and in perpetrators. And the story of the little boy in Uganda, I think, is a good example of that. That there's always more than one victim. There's the person who's on the other side, who may be doing some of these things, is also victimized by the circumstances. And you know, so much of what you're describing in your book is so true at this very moment, not for the obvious reasons of what's happening in Ukraine, but just that we do this over and over and over and over again, that we just can't seem to learn from this. And I wonder how you have hope, how you, in your book is not, it's not maudlin, it's not depressing, it really has a lot of hope in it. But how do you sustain that? What do you look for when you're going to one of these situations, and how do you continue to try to have the strength to record these events and yet also be hopeful?
Well, I get in despair sometimes, but you know, I travel as a mother. I'm a mother, a grandmother, and I sometimes wish I had studied medicine. I wish I'd had skills that could be practical, hands-on work to help with recovery of people that have been so deeply wounded. But I guess I have always had a big capacity for empathy, compassion, and for love. You know, that's what mothers take into the world, is love. And I guess just little things like that I find, I see the humanity, I see the beauty in people. In Nicaragua, one of my favorite people was a comandante, Tomas Borge. I mean, he had been the revolutionary fighter, and yet he had mustered the ability to forgive when he was arrested. He was able to forgive those people that had tortured him and hung him from the thumbs and so on. I see the humanity in everybody. I had an experience in one of the volunteer things I did in Pasadena was I used to go to Head Start, and I took my little blonde, blue-eyed children to Head Start so they could see some diversity. And it was a school in Northwest Pasadena where they were all Black kids. There were kids there who had never sat in a chair, kids who had never used a fork and knife, had never been held, had never seen a book. And there was one little bully boy in that group. His name was Mark, and he just kept punching the other kids. He wouldn't share, he'd throw things. And so the Head Start teacher asked me, would I just stay with Mark one-on-one? And I put Mark, I took him outside so he wouldn't disrupt the classroom, and I put him in a swing and started pushing him. And he just screamed, terrified. And I went around in the front, and he leaped off and put his arms and legs around and just held on to me. And I realized that little boy was a bully because he was scared to death. And so when I confront bullies, I always think of Mark. You know, I don't want to go one-to-one with people like Milosevic or Vladimir Putin for that matter, but you know, it's the human condition is difficult. And I think everybody, I mean, there is nobody that's beyond redemption. And I just look for that spark of humanity. And often, you know, I am the beneficiary of so much inspiration.
You know,
Louise.
I think it's important that what the message that you're sending, you know, Elie Wiesel once said that the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And I think
Exactly.
that, you know, it's so important that people like yourself who has spent so much time in these places bring those stories back and tell us what's happened in those places. And I think for those of us who work in some of those places, and it doesn't have to be even overseas, you know, certainly in, you know, our own cities, we have situations that are pretty horrific, that it's important that we try to get over the indifference of society to do something, you know, bigger than what's happening. And I to me, that's sort of the stuff that keeps people going. And forgiveness, I think you think of people like Nelson Mandela, who spent 27 years on Robb Island and Robben Island, and you know, and yet came out and was able to turn that country.
What a role model.
Yeah.
He's the ultimate role model.
Yeah.
Well, you know, love is an awesome force, and it's a decision. Love is an action. To me, it's a verb.
Yeah.
Yes, Louise.
Yeah. Louise.
Oh, yes. Well, first, thank you. I mean, this is tremendously moving, and I will get your book. I don't know if you can help me with this. It's about Ukraine and Putin and the issue of nuclear war. I am personally completely, you know, on the side of Ukraine. And for me, what Putin is doing is a replay of what Hitler did with the Anschluss and all of this. And I know that some conservatives in the United States admire Putin, but also, to my own personal dismay, some of my very progressive leftist friends are going with the narrative that NATO and the increase of militarization of NATO and the expansion of NATO is the reason why Putin feels assaulted. And in fact, somebody, what's her name, the one from Hawaii, resigned from the Democratic Party today or yesterday, saying that they're militaristic, you know, we're sending more weapons to Ukraine, and that is increasing the danger of nuclear war. And I personally, I cannot defend Putin, and I'm totally on the side of Ukraine, but I do not know what to say to these friends. And I like the Socialist Party of the United States is the DSA. They're against this whole
They're
approach.
putting out a lot of nonsense, I know.
Exactly. I find it's nonsense, but they are saying they fear nuclear war, they fear militarization. So how to handle people like this? So that's my question.
Well, Putin is neither rational nor normal in many ways, as you know, and I think he's gone over the top. But he's obsessed with putting the Soviet Union back together. He's upset. He sees himself as Peter the Great. He wants to put the Soviet Union back together. He wants the power. The primary goal, the gem of the former Soviet Union is Ukraine, because Ukraine has always been the breadbasket. Stalin had the starved the Ukrainians. They went down, took all the food from all the farmers and left the Ukrainians with none. There has been a history of Ukraine being fought over and divided and conquered all throughout history. This is nothing more than a land grab. And if he were successful with Ukraine, he would keep going, because he wants all of the Soviet Union back together. But Ukraine is his number one goal. I think he was shocked at the resistance. He really believed that they would come out with flowers and welcome the tanks onto their streets. He's really a nutcase, but he's a very dangerous man. He's a very, very dangerous man.
Yeah, sorry to say, Jen, I totally agree with everything you're saying, and I see it clearly. The question is, how do I discuss this with those people who are trying to say NATO is at fault and the US is at fault?
Well, I think NATO recognizes, actually everything that's happened is the opposite of what Putin wanted. We've expanded NATO. We've added 2 countries to NATO, and I think NATO has come closer, and all democratic governments are wanting to support Ukraine, because they see what we're seeing globally is really a clash of the autocrats versus the democracies. The autocrats are banding together. You've got Xi in China waiting to see what happens to Putin's. If he were successful, he'd go into Taiwan. I'm just sure of that. Erdogan in Turkey. All of the autocrats are banding together. Iran is now sending weaponized drones over to the Russian forces. It is extremely important to stand up. We have to support them militarily. I absolutely believe that.
I was thinking, Jane, with some of the, I know Clinton had a lot of regret and remorse that he didn't act sooner in the Yugoslavian situation, that genocide could have been really prevented. Srebrenica probably wouldn't have happened if we'd gotten over there and done something.
Yugoslavia and Rwanda.
And Rwanda, of course, both of those, I think. And I think
the Canadian UN peacekeepers that were trying to, screaming and yelling for support.
Yeah, I think that those are very, as we were mentioning here at the very beginning about, the lack of the United States diddling around in the Second World War when genocide was happening in Europe. I think that those events speak to the fact that sometimes you do need to go in, and although war is a terrible thing and it can bring more war, sometimes you have to do it. And I think that I agree with you that I think Putin, he would have grabbed Lithuania and Latvia and all of those other places, Estonia.
It's the only thing they understand. But one of the themes of my book, probably the ultimate theme of my book, is that war is the real enemy. War itself is the enemy of life on Earth. But there are times, you have to stand up. There's no question about it. And this is one of the cases. Putin is committing war crimes every day, and he needs to be tried for them at some point. He needs to be brought before the International Criminal Court, which is what happened to Milosevic and Karadzic in the former Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
But
I think one of the other themes of your book too that really struck me, and this probably comes from, you as an individual and as a woman and as a mother and grandmother, is the power of women, that their resilience, their ability, certainly the story of Mency and Happy and some of these other people that have just gone through horrendously awful things, that they're able to draw on something. And women have done that through the ages, where they've been the victims of these sort of situations, and yet they don't become victimized by it. They carry on and they pull themselves together, and they can kind of make the best of really horrendously awful situations.
Yeah, sustain and nurture life.
Yeah. So it's a very disturbing time, but I don't feel hopeless. And I think that, books like yours are very, very important. I would encourage everybody to read Jane's book. It's extremely powerful. And it's a very personal and tender recollection of your interactions with people and during very dire situations. But I think it's very, very relevant to what's happening right now.
Well, one of the reasons I wanted to publish now is because there's so much polarization. There's so much attack on the truth. There's so much anger and hatred and judgment and division among us. And by showing all of these people who are both the victims and the perpetrators, it's putting a face on the other and seeing the humanity and those that we consider to be the enemy. And the oneness of all life. And what's going to bring us together is the global climate crisis. Maybe we need a common enemy. And the climate crisis is certainly a common enemy that might bring us together if we can learn to work together.
Well, I sort of thought COVID might have done that. That might have been a light spot with COVID, but I don't think it's done that, unfortunately. I think it's sort of added salt to the wounds. But we do have a question from Ann Gallen in Bakersfield is, does the International Criminal Court in The Hague have any teeth, or do the human crimes you saw even reach their level of attention?
Well, it does, but to some extent, does the United Nations have any teeth? The United Nations was set up right after World War II with a Security Council that includes the US, China, and Russia. And so it's so hard to get any kind of agreement out of the United Nations. I think the criminal court at the ICC at The Hague has had some victories. The cases are very long, and the punishment is not. Certainly they don't have a death penalty, for instance. The punishment may not be what you would think would meet the crime. But one of the benefits of the International Criminal Court is that the victims get to confront the perpetrators. They get to tell their stories and be heard. The witnessing, the testimony is so important, and that in itself can be healing. And for the perpetrators to face the victims, that's part of their punishment, to understand, what a pariah they are in the face of their own citizens. I would say it's certainly better than what we had before, those individual tribunals that every time there was a mass genocide or major conflict, a specific country criminal court would have to be stood up, usually in a neighboring country, like Tanzania hosted the Rwanda court. And it takes so long to get, just to get the mechanism of it, that often some of the victims will have died before they can get to the court. I think it's remains to be seen whether we can try people that come from white democracies. So far, most of the indicted criminals that have been at The Hague in front of the International Criminal Court, all of the first ones were from Africa. That's why I mentioned the security court, the Security Council being such an impediment, because we've never signed the International Criminal Court Treaty because we don't want any Americans to be accused and brought before the courts. And many other countries and feel the same. They think they have their own justice system. So far we've tried mostly people like Idi Amin. But it's certainly better than what we had before. And I think just to get the truth out there is certainly worth it.
You talked about, I think it was, I think you pronounced it the Gacaca trials in Rwanda that were sort of local trials in an effort, but there's so many, and it was so confusing as to the Hutus and the Tutsis and who did what and so forth. Do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Well, yes, I got to attend. Alison DeForge, who was the head of the Human Rights Watch Africa division, lived in, I mean, she had a PhD in Rwanda, and she lived there for 40 some years and knew everybody, and people came directly. She wrote a 1,000-page book called Leave None to Tell the Story, which is the sort of the encyclopedia on the genocide of Rwanda. So when I was chairing the board of Human Rights Watch, I took some board members and supporters over there, and she took us around the country to different Gacaca trials. Gacaca means justice on the grass. And what they did, they had hundreds of thousands of accused genocidaires in prisons. And for 10 years, they were used as slave labor. They had to wear pink jumpsuits, and they were building roads and, forced to work during the day to rebuild Rwanda. And then at night they'd be in prison, and they were being fed by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And after 10 years, the ICRC said they would no longer feed them, and that they had to find some kind of a formal way to try to charge the prisoners with crimes and to try them. And there were so many thousands that the only way they could do it is they set up courts all over the country, and they had trained local judges, many of whom hadn't even gone to high school, but they got some kind of training. And then on every single Thursday, all work in Rwanda would stop, and everybody in the community had to attend these Gacaca trials. It was mandatory. So in these little villages and in parts of Kigali also, everybody knew everybody. So the criminal would, the accused genocidaire would come forward with 2 guards, and he'd have to face the court. There'd be 9 judges, and all the people in the community could accuse him of something. If anybody knew him, they had the right to testify and accuse him of anything. So he had to face the community. And at one, I had the privilege of attending one of the most interesting of all. There was a young man who was accused of killing 6 people, and they only tried those. You had to have killed at least 3 people before you were brought before the court, because there were everybody had some blood on their hands. And in this little setup, it was kind of on a bare grass park kind of thing, with just a tent overhead and open on the sides, and logs to sit on. So the criminal was named, and a woman who was sitting behind me ran up to him, and she said, all of this is being translated for me because it was being spoken in Kinyarwanda. She said, "You killed my father, you killed my brother." And someone else would say the same. And then the judge asked the woman for the circumstances. Did she see him? How could she identify him? And she said, "I saw him. He killed my father and my brother on our porch. He killed another man beside the road. I saw him chop off his head." But she said, then when I was walking with my son, my young son, I think he was like 4 years old, she was fleeing Rwanda and trying to walk towards the Congo, across the border, as if that's a safe place. She said, My son got lost, but this man who killed my father and my brother went searching, and he found my son and brought him back to me. So I can no longer hate him so much. And that's the kind of stories. I mean, everybody has stories like that to tell. You know, it's because the killers and the victims were all fleeing at the same time. They're walking down the road. They're running down the road trying to get across the border. And some of them are carrying bloody machetes, and others are, you know, wounded and grieving the losses of their family, and they're all fleeing together. It was just the most bizarre thing to hear all those stories. But they're still sorting that out.
You know, Dr. Mattioli asked a question, Jane, about the fact that there continues to be so much war activities around the world, and it's very impactful, but poverty itself certainly is something that creates very difficult situations for people. And she wanted you maybe to, and had you any thoughts about keeping that relevant in the international sphere, that war gets our attention, but poverty is sort of this grinding thing that always is contributing to terrible problems.
Yes, and poverty, of course, is very connected to climate change. Certainly in Africa, we can see some of those countries are soon going to be completely unlivable. Well, and in our own inner cities, you know, poor people who are desperate. What was the theme of Les Mis? He stole a loaf of bread to feed his nephew, his sister's child, and was put away in prison and, you know, the chain gang for how many years. Crime and poverty are very much associated, and we don't want to look into that connection. And which is why I wanted to put a face on the victims, because we're going to see mass starvation in the Horn of Africa very soon. I mean, it's already there, but it's going to be. Do you remember in the 80s when they showed all the pictures of babies dying and they flies in their eyes and so on? That's happening now.
Yeah.
And I think within the first world, there's a tedium of being constantly asked to send supplies for the poor that are starving and dying. And I've heard a lot of grumbling about the fact that when war happens in a place like Ukraine, where they're, you know, white, middle class people that look like the majority of Americans, you know, we rally and send so much food and medical supplies and guns and everything else, while in the grinding poverty areas, we want to look away because we think it's hopeless.
Yeah.
That's why I wanted to go into those areas and photograph those people and tell their stories, because they're beautiful and there's so little complaining. They have so little, and there's so little complaining, and they, you know, they help each other. I met a woman in Malawi whose own daughter and son-in-law had died to HIV/AIDS, and she took in her grandchildren. She took in 5 grandchildren. And then there were so many children in the village who lost their parents, and they all came to her house. Her name was Grace. She had adopted 54 children, mostly, you know, many of them preschool kids in diapers. And she was in this little, you know, very, very poor house that just had, you know, dirt ground and a fence around it. There were kids climbing all over her and all over everything. And people in the village would bring her clothing and food to help with it. But I mean, you see people like that, and it makes you realize, I have a pantry full of food. I have a freezer full of food. And
well, I think that, you know, and that's sort of an objective with our project, is, thank you for setting this up for us. I can give a pitch, is that I think that one of the things that we've really discovered in the 20 years we've been working in Tanzania, which also has had a horrendous problem with HIV/AIDS and orphans and so forth, is that perhaps the best way to address some of the poverty that we see is to empower the people that are the victims of it themselves. to educate them to become healthcare workers, to educate them to become politicians or writers or poets or teachers or secretaries, and so that they can change from with themselves, change what's happening in their countries. With the help, you need to have antiretroviral therapy to stop the spread of AIDS, and that's been a very important part of trying to control the pandemic there. But you also need to have healthcare workers to distribute that and to understand how to use them and so forth. And so we've really made an effort in our project to focus on educating doctors, nurses, social workers, and veterinarians, all kinds of healthcare workers, so that they can begin to build their future, and with some help from the outside world. It's our obligation. And I think the other piece of this, going back to sort of COVID, is that what happens in these countries matters to us, because these are places where diseases emerge, where zoonotic spillover events happen.
Mhm.
It doesn't even have to be Africa. It could be a wet market in China. And I know Jane would want to put in we'll call her OJ. Well, that's not a good moniker. Never mind, we'll call it that. Dame Jane would want to put in a note on the protection of animals and that piece to protect our own species. So there's this collectiveness that I think that we fail to see so much at the time, because we get bogged down in the politics and the evil that is created by people grabbing things. And I think that, your book, as dramatic and raw and really horrendous are the descriptions that you put in there, very beautifully written and tenderly written, it still makes me hopeful when you read it. And I think that comes from you as a person, that in spite of all of these things that you've documented and seen, that you still have that hope. And I hope that is something that your readers will get out of it, because it certainly was something I felt. And I would encourage everyone who's attended this really remarkable event this evening to get Jane's book and to read it.
Right. Well, we're really all connected, and you're absolutely right. So much better to empower. And that was a story of these girls being taught a craft. They were taught, fashion design and modeling, and in that they build self-esteem.
Yeah.
Reach out to help others.
Well,
we're
I'd
really
like to-
all connected. There's no question. I'd love to go and see your program with you sometime.
Anytime you can. We've got a marvelous team, and as my favorite thing is when we have an emergency on the airplane and the pilot comes on and goes, are there any medical personnel on board? And we say, there's an entire hospital on board.
I love that. Well, I have a niece on the call who I think might like to go with me.
Oh, well, we would be happy to take you. So, we could talk all night long about this, Jane. It's just, this was fabulous. And I know that our audience who was very, very moved by it. And I think that Dr. Powell, who's just a fabulous pediatrician who's been with us on many trips and had many children wee on him in our clinics, wants to just try to convince those that are the privileged part of the world to really pay attention, that indifference is not something that you have to do, and that you do have to send the message out to people that we're all in this together and we need to help each other. And I think your book does that as well. So I would encourage everybody to get Jane's book. It's on Amazon. Maybe we can even get her to.
And the other thing is, it's on my website. It's actually a little cheaper on the website because Amazon takes a cut. It's www.worldcitizenthebook.com.
There you go.
Worldcitizenthebook.com.
If you need that.
All right.
Yeah. So thank you. I hope this is the first of revisits to us, more stories from your book and just your life experiences, and just many, many thanks, Jane. What a wonderful evening.
Well, anything for you.